We shall commence this module by discussing the instruments of macroeconomic policy. Fiscal policy and monetary policy are two important instruments of macroeconomic policy of a government. They play a useful role in attaining macroeconomic objectives of economic growth, full employment, price stability, and distributive justice. Fiscal policy comprises a mix of budgetary instruments that the government uses to target particular macroeconomic objectives. The revenue raised from taxes and non-tax sources are used to pay for government activities and expenditure decisions to help achieve the goals of the government. Monetary policy refers to changes in the interest rates and money supply which is under the control of the Central Bank of India, that is Reserve Bank of India, which is an autonomous institution outside the government. However, fiscal policy is directly under the control of the government, subject to legislative control. Monetary and fiscal policies are important instruments available to a government that influence the economic activities at the macroeconomic level and also ensure smooth functioning of the economy. These two policies are independent of each other. According to G.K. Shaw, any decision to change the level, composition or timing of government expenditure or to vary the burden, the structure or frequency of tax payments is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy composed of tax policy, expenditure policy, investment and disinvestment strategies and debt management policy. It is an important constituent of the overall economic framework of a country and is therefore intimately linked with its general economic policy strategy. This module examines the scope of fiscal policy in the economic framework of the country and its economic objectives. After studying this module, you shall be able to know the meaning and scope of fiscal policy, understand the mechanism of fiscal policy, understand the objectives of fiscal policy, examine the fiscal policy and economic growth and how they are related to each other, examine the fiscal policy and distributive justice, examine the fiscal policy and price stability, and examine the relationship between fiscal policy and full employment. Now we shall discuss about evolution and scope of fiscal policy. With the economic development process, numerous strategies and policies underwent changes. No other branch of economics has undergone such revolutionary development as fiscal theory and policy. Furthermore, before the Great Depression, the fiscal policy was practically unknown. During those times, the government's approach to the economy was laissez-faire, that is, free from government control and regulations. J.M. Keynes, in his book The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, did not agree with the aim of fiscal policy as suggested by classical economists. This early belief of minimum interference and avoidance of deficits was replaced by the Keynesian with a new view of promoting stability. The Great Depression of 1930s was seen as a failure of capitalism and markets. State intervention seemed to record one success after another. In the post-Keynesian period, the emphasis was on the short-run stability, but with the theoretical developments, the shift was in the favor of long-run stability. The whole basis of public finance was revolutionized in developed economies, while in underdeveloped and developing economies, including India, the economists recommended the application of Keynesian techniques. However, the condition of the underdeveloped economies were different from those postulated by Keynes. In the developing countries, centralized planning, corrective interventions in resource allocation, economic nationalism were the components of the development strategy adopted at independence, which emphasized the prevalence of market failure and the central role of state in correcting them. By the 1960s, the role of government was involved in every aspect of the economy, administering prices and regulation of labor, foreign exchange and financial markets. Everything was done through government control only. The cost of this development strategy got exposed when the debt crisis hit in the 1980s with the oil price shocks. The collapse of Soviet Union was largely due to the countless number of drastic reforms, but was hailed as superiority of capitalism over socialism. In the 1990s, countries had scaled back the size and function of government, with market-friendly strategies being a major strategy in many parts of the developing world. However, with the recent global financial crisis of 2007 posing the threat of worldwide recession led to many countries to have a more active fiscal policy. Thus, it is realistic to formulate a sound fiscal policy in regard to the economic conditions that exist in a country. In its formulation for the country, it must be taken into account: number one, what is the stage of economic development for the country? Secondly, the degree of elasticity of response of the system to the economic stimuli, and thirdly, the state of the economy at any given time. The importance of fiscal policy in developing countries arises from the fact that the state under democratic control plays a proactive role in stabilizing the economy and promoting economic development using indirect controls like monetary and fiscal policies. The government needs to intervene when the market is unable to allocate goods and services optimally, because its production is lump and it cannot be charged to consumers individually through the market mechanism, or their production may need large investment that private sector are not able to undertake. Thus, according to Musgrave, 1959, the provision of public goods reflecting its indivisibility, correction of negative externalities, and improvement of income distribution and stabilization of the economy are legitimate areas of government activity. The government also carries a responsibility to distributive incomes in a way that will maintain social welfare and protect the vulnerable section of the society. Thus, fiscal policy is an important instrument of the government by means of which it can achieve the objectives of economic development. Now, moving on to discuss the mechanism of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the policy of the government related to its own expenditure and taxes in order to influence the aggregate demand, that is AD. Depending upon existing state of the economy, government can employ either expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy increases the aggregate demand, whereas contractionary fiscal policy reduces the aggregate demand. Changes in the level timing and composition of government spending and taxation have an important effect on the economy. It is one of the very important demand side policies. Demand side policies focus on changing the AD or shifting the AD curve in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model in order to achieve the objectives of price stability, full employment and economic growth. Consider the equation y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m. On the left side is y, that is GDP, which represents the total value of goods and services produced in the economy. On the right side are the components of aggregate demand, that is private consumption C, private investment I, government expenditure on goods and services represented by G, and exports minus imports, that is net exports represented by NX. The consumption is dependent on the disposable income YD, which is income that remains after tax payments T. That implies disposable income YD will be equal to Y minus T. So it has Y and T as variables. This equation also makes it evident that the government effect on economic activity controlling G directly and influencing C, I and NX indirectly through changes in taxation, transfers and spending is possible. Fiscal policy that increases aggregate demand directly through an increase in government expenditure or lowering taxes is typically called expansionary policy. By contrast, fiscal policy is often considered contractionary policy if it reduces aggregate demand via lower expenditure or raising taxes. Fiscal policy influences all of these components of AD. C, that is consumption, is influenced by imposing taxes on consumers, for example personal income taxes. I, or investment, is influenced by imposing taxes on business profits. Similarly, government can easily change its own expenditure. Moreover, it influences X minus M by means of subsidies provided to the domestic producers, import tax and so on. Let us now discuss the objectives of fiscal policy. The government's involvement in macroeconomic coordination with the objective of stabilizing the economy is crucial. Fiscal policy is comprised of mix of budgetary instruments which refer to the use of taxation and non-tax revenues and the government expenditure to influence the aggregate level of economic activities at the macroeconomic level. It aims to achieve economic objectives with the soundness of public finance. The objectives of fiscal policy are more or less same in developed and underdeveloped countries. According to Heller, the objectives of tax and budgetary policy in underdeveloped countries are to promote investment, to maintain stability and to reduce extreme inequalities in wealth and income. These objectives are not different from objectives of fiscal policy in developed economies, that are economic growth, stability and optimum income distribution. The major objectives of fiscal policy are: number 1, to mobilize resources for sustainable economic growth. Secondly, to achieve the target of full employment. Thirdly, to restrain price instability in order to ensure economic stability. And fourthly, to achieve equitable distribution of income and wealth. Firstly, let us talk about economic growth. The fundamental objective of fiscal policy in a developing economy is to achieve rapid economic growth and development. The developing countries are in the vicious cycle of poverty. This can be broken by mobilization and efficient allocation of resources only. Capital formation is an important determinant of economic growth. The savings have to be mobilized and channeled to productive investment. To achieve high capital formation, it is necessary to accelerate savings and investment rate, which in turn affects productivity growth in the economy. Fiscal policy is an efficient and equitable way of mobilizing resources for accelerating public investment. It may affect the rate of saving and the willingness to invest and may thereby influence the rate of capital formation. Through the effective fiscal policies, the government can mobilize resources. One of the fiscal instruments is taxation, which can be used for mobilizing resources for capital formation in the public sector. By designing an appropriate tax structure, resources can be raised for public authorities for administration and development. The imposition of progressive direct taxes such as income tax or corporate tax and high rate of indirect taxes on luxury goods and services consumed by high income individuals and on undesirable items. In this way, government can discourage consumption and production of such items. The production of life necessities and employment-oriented industries can be encouraged by offering tax concessions or subsidies. Public borrowing is another fiscal instrument by which savings could be mobilized for economic development. Public borrowings become necessary because taxation alone cannot provide sufficient resource needed for economic development. The allocation function is another important fiscal function to enhance economic growth. Fiscal policy should be designed in such a way that should ensure the optimum allocation of resources. The total resources are divided between private and social goods and by which the mix of social goods are chosen. The private goods are provided in the market due to rivalry and excludability, whereas social goods are provided through budgetary finance as the market fails in its provision due to non-excludability, that is, users cannot be prevented from consuming the good, and non-rivalry, that is, consumption by one user does not reduce the supply available to others. The fiscal policy ensures that the resources are allocated for the production of socially desirable goods and discourage those that are socially undesirable. The resources should be diverted from unproductive sectors to the productive sectors of the economy. Next, let us talk about distributive justice. Distributive justice is an important objective of fiscal policy. It relates to the redistribution of income and wealth. The pattern of distribution determined by the market forces is not necessary, which society considers fair and just. Distributional adjustments are called for through efficient fiscal policy. A welfare state should provide social justice by giving equitable distribution of income and wealth. The distribution of economic resources depend on two factors. Firstly, distribution of factor endowments such as personal income or earning capacity and ownership of accumulated or inherited wealth, and secondly, prices of these factors in the market. Suppose in the market the businesses would want to maximize their profits and the public who consumes a mix of goods and services would want these goods and services to be supplied wherever they want. In a competitive economy, profit maximizing firms will be forced to pay factors of production according to their productivity, that is, returns to the factors of production reflecting their productivity. This means Those who are skillful and able to take the opportunity would benefit, and those who are not would receive little or no income. To some, this would be market success, and to others, the distribution of income can never be a purely economic concept. Thus, to contribute significant change in the distribution of income, the government plays a pivotal role. This is accompanied through taxing powers and expenditure responsibilities of the government carried through fiscal policy. According to Musgrave, among various fiscal instruments, redistribution is implemented most directly by following methods. First is tax transfer scheme, combining progressive taxation of high income with a subsidy to low income households. Secondly, progressive taxes used to finance public services that particularly benefit low income households. And thirdly, a combination of high taxes on goods consumed by high income consumers with subsidies to other goods that are used by low income consumers. Tax policy influences the distribution of income and wealth through the main instruments, that is direct taxation on income, wealth on property transactions, or taxation on commodities and services purchased largely by high income group, and subsidies on goods purchased by low income groups or transfers. Taxation of the rich will reduce savings and thus retard development efforts. The objective of distributive justice comes in conflict with economic growth. It diverts the purchasing power from richer to poor sections of the economy, encourages consumption, and diverts resources from investment and feeds the inflation. The equitable distribution destroys incentive for production on one hand and sources of savings on other. Thus, the government carries a responsibility to redistribute income and wealth in such a way that balance equity and growth, while at the same time ensure the incentives to the private sector for its productive activity. Therefore, in designing the fiscal policy, it is essential to achieve proper balance between the objectives of the economy. Another objective is price stability. Economic stability is important aim of a sound fiscal policy. Economic growth and stability are the twin objectives jointly pursued by a developing country's fiscal policy. Stability does not refer to the stabilization of price level alone, but stability in all the phases of economic transaction and growth. Fiscal policy is a key instrument in the hands of the government to achieve all-round stability and prosperity. It is a tool through which the economic resources could be allocated in the best possible way and maintains full employment with relative price stabilization. Economic instability occurs due to cyclical fluctuations caused by aggregate demand shocks and aggregate supply shocks. Inflation and deflation are two short-run instability situations. At times, the level of aggregate demand may be insufficient to secure full employment of labor and other factors of production. At other times, aggregate demand may exceed available output at full employment level. Fiscal policy can be effectively used by the government to correct the disequilibria in an economy. Inflation would be curbed and deflation should be avoided. Inflation causes a rise in prices and continuous fluctuations by creating disequilibrium in the economy. It becomes highly essential to check inflation. Fiscal policy can control inflation if implemented efficiently and bring the economic stability. The government should impose high taxes to check the increasing aggregate demand, and the government expenditure should be reduced to the extent that it may be able to contract the increased spending of the private sector. When the government is unable to meet the expenditure through the revenue received, it tries to make it through public borrowings. The public borrowings reduce the purchasing power of the people. It may be called anti-inflationary measure. On the other hand, deflation is continuous price fall and fall in the purchasing power. It is characterized by low aggregate demand and fall in the spending and investment. The government must raise its expenditure to achieve the objective of full employment. This may be done by undertaking public works, employment schemes, tax rebates or fall in taxes, which may help in improving the situation. Thus, the expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy of the government can change the level of aggregate demand and the real GDP and thereby control inflation and curb deflation. Another important objective of fiscal policy is to achieve full employment and maintain economic stability in the country. Countries try to remove unemployment and attain full employment. Full employment means the qualified people who seek jobs at prevailing wage rates can find them in productive activities without considerable delay. It refers to that situation where there is no involuntary unemployment in the economy. The government makes every possible effort to achieve full employment in the country through effective fiscal measures. The government tends to increase its public expenditure in infrastructure, public works and social security measures that result in upliftment of the level of aggregate demand, investment and employment. Taxation should be structured in such a way that promotes and sustains consumption and investment. The lowering of direct taxes like income tax or corporate tax encourages more savings and investment and consequently creates more employment. Once the objective of full employment is attained, it has to be maintained by adopting appropriate fiscal measures. However, it is difficult to achieve full employment as the factor markets are not perfect. In a developing country, there is a problem of disguised unemployment that can be solved by fiscal policy through increase in public expenditure to provide alternate employment opportunities. Let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. Fiscal policy comprises a mix of budgetary instruments that the government use to target economic objectives of the country. It is the use of government spending and taxation to influence the economy. The objectives of fiscal policy are the achievement of economic growth, distributive justice, price stability and full employment. Fiscal policy is the policy of the government related to its own expenditure and taxes in order to influence the aggregate demand. The government employs either expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy via increase in government expenditure or reduction in taxes would increase the aggregate demand, whereas contractionary fiscal policy via reduction in government expenditure and raise in taxes would reduce the aggregate demand. Changes in the level, timing and composition of government spending and taxation have an important effect on the economy. The fundamental objective of fiscal policy in a developing economy is to achieve rapid economic growth and development. This could be achieved by mobilizing the resources to the desired channel of investments and optimally allocate the resources to socially desirable goods and services. Distributive justice is an important objective of fiscal policy. It relates to the distribution of income and wealth. Tax and transfer policies offer an effective measure of implementation distribution adjustments of fiscal policy. Inflation and deflation are two instability situations in the short run. Fiscal policy is the key instrument in the hands of the government to achieve all-round stability and prosperity. It is a tool through which economic resources could be allocated in the best possible way and maintain full employment with relative price stabilization. the government makes every possible effort to achieve full employment in the country through effective fiscal measures, either by increasing government expenditure or by reducing taxes, or the combination of two measures.